Thank you, Renee, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you might be joining from. Again, my name is Dean Snyder from AFS, and I'm here to provide you with an update on LIBOR and SOFR. And our agenda for today will be to give you a recap on the most recent working group meeting in New York, November 18th and 19th. And we're actually going to show you some of the slides that have been shared by the ARRC as a result of that meeting, rather than AFS rewrite all the messaging. We're going to go through some of their slides, give you an idea where the ARRC committee stands currently with LIBOR transition. And then we will go over the AFS progress on supporting of LIBOR transition, as well as some informational notes and next steps at the end. As Renee said, I'll take questions after we go through these slides. I will try to allow plenty of time for that. This journey started, I think, for us and then the ARRC committee back on January 28th, when the first meeting was held in person in New York with the bank working group and made up of many banks from really around the world, as well as major loan system vendors, to work through the transition from LIBOR. And since January 28th, there have been multiple on-site meetings and many more web calls and phone meetings to work through the operational issues of the LIBOR transition. On November 18th, the group met again. We also were joined by representatives from the UK and some other markets, because this truly is a global issue to be dealt with. And on the second day, the committee actually arranged for 2 separate sessions with business focus groups, where banks were invited to bring people representing the business to hear what's being proposed and get additional feedback from that. As a result, a presentation was conducted by the ARRC committee last week, and we're going to go through those slides a little bit more at a high level. I know some of you probably were on that call, but not necessarily everyone. So we're going to go ahead and advance into the slides. I'll actually go to the next agenda slide for that. Bear with me for a minute. I'll get my slides going. So the agenda for this slide deck was to talk about, really talk about SOFR as a replacement to LIBOR and the different methods or ways to calculate interest with SOFR. And this, of course, is going to carry on to other currencies that we know in the UK with Sonia, and the Euro with Esther, and so forth. But certainly the committee is focusing with SOFR and the US market, and I think making sure the industry, when I say we, can support this transition, and of course making sure that it is supported by the other markets as well beyond the US. So as we go to the first slide on this deck, what's being proposed, of course, is that by replacing LIBOR with a different alternative reference rate, in this case SOFR, there are different ways or methods to be able to calculate SOFR interest. We've covered this in prior sessions where there were 4 calculation methods, and 3 of the 4 work very much like LIBOR today, with a fixed rate available, and they are supported by AFS today, both level 3 and AFS Vision. But the challenge comes with this concept of compounding interest, this fourth method. So the slide here explains that you've got a simple interest calculation. We all know how to do that, but a compounded interest calculation is really a new way to do interest. And if we move to the next slide, we know that daily simple interest is taking the daily rate times the principal and using your basis code to come up with your daily interest. In a compounded interest formula, the interest is really compounded day by day during the borrowing period. So if we go forward, the ARRC committee did do a study about simple SOFR rate similar to compounded SOFR. You'll see that the differences are not dramatic, but they are different. And so the calculations are different. So the working group of the ARRC is looking at how to support this compounded concept. And we'll talk in a few slides about why we're looking at that. But to go forward with some of the differences, I'll skip through simple interest because I think everyone on the call should understand simple interest. That's how commercial loans have always been done. But we move into the compound interest slide, and as we've discussed this, we've learned that there are actually two ways to do compounded interest, and they're listed here on the slide. So method one is, in a true compounding sense, is you accrue one day's interest, and then the next day when you accrue on the principal plus the prior day's interest, or in this case, the accumulated unpaid interest. So that as you go forward through the borrowing period, your accrued unpaid interest continues to accumulate. So each day as you're calculating that next day's interest, it's a compounded base with the principal plus the interest. Now, in studying this, the ARRC and representatives realized that there's a second way to achieve a similar result for compounding, and that would be to apply a compounded rate on a daily basis. So rather than keep track of the unpaid interest and accruing on principal plus interest, what you do is, through this mathematical formula listed here, is you actually calculate what an equivalent compounded rate would be, and you just use that to accrue against your principal balance. So those are the two methods that are being considered. And I think we'll go to the one that says strengths and weaknesses. So why are we talking about compounded interest? Well, compounded interest does reflect the true time value of money. However, on the weaknesses side, it's obviously going to add a lot of complexity to loan systems and to lenders and to borrowers in understanding the complexity and trying to understand how interest is calculated, and certainly any communication like billing statements or notices to a syndication lender group will all have to be modified and include a lot of additional information to be able to understand and verify how the compounded interest was calculated. If we go to the next page, it was determined that in doing compounding, there had to be consideration for what happens when there are interim balance activity, payments, pay downs, and so forth. And that adds even additional complexity to all the different scenarios to make sure that we can support everything that needs to be done. Once the compounding of the interest is done, and again, back to whether we're going to do a compounded balance or a compounded rate, there's still these two ways to do that. Then you further get into what happens in syndicated deals, where you as the agent bank are managing the loan to the borrower and then have to distribute the compounded interest to all the members in the deal. Well, in that case, there are two different methods for that as well. And the first one is what we call a pro rata method, where the agent bank will calculate the accrued interest to the borrower using a compounded method in this case, and then allocate that interest to each of the members in the deal on a pro rata basis, based on their pro rata share or percentage in that deal. Now, one of the challenges with this, of course, is that happens at the end of the borrowing period, where the agent bank can determine how much does each member get. However, if you're on the receiving end, if you're one of those member banks or institutions, you're tracking on your own loan system what your share of the global deal is and what your accrued interest is on a daily basis. So at the end of the borrowing period, your system should foot with what the agent system has calculated. And as we're working through these examples, we're seeing there can be challenges in some scenarios in having these balances match on a pro rata method. So the other way to do this is what we call an independent method, where each lender share, each member in a deal, whatever is calculated independently to ensure that your share is matching up with what the agent share is. So this is listed here because the ARRC committee is looking for feedback on these methods and what the preference might be for the individual banks or lending institutions. The chart here on this slide is showing you some of the, again, complexities of doing a compounded interest calculation on a daily basis. So you can see each row representing days in the borrowing period and different rates, because the SOFR rate is, again, going to be published on a daily basis. And if you were to calculate this on a pro rata basis or independent calculation for the members, where differences can appear. So I wasn't going to get into the details of this with this group today, but the reason we're showing you this is so that you understand, again, the complexity that the bank working group is wrestling with, and of course, AFS as a vendor, making sure that we're able to support the methods that the business or the industry settle on. So when we talk about this distribution method, pro rata versus independent calculation, there's obviously different, there's pros and cons for each one. AFS as a vendor has always followed the independent calculation method, and we believe that that gives you more precision with your loan platform because you're calculating your share of deals individually so that you can validate what your interest is due to your institution. Now, the weakness listed here is that it may be more operationally complex for the agent, which we recognize, but at the same time, it's most important that the agent and the global borrower interest and all the member interest will match up. So, key questions that were on the slide deck. Bear with me, I may have had an interruption in the webcast, but I will continue to go over these verbally while we get the slides back. Make sure that people are still hearing me. Can you verify that, Joe, that the audio is still working? Just bear with us for a minute, please. Continue to bear with us. All right, hopefully that we are back. And we're going to skip forward to the key questions for the business. As we said, we're working through these different compounding formulas and as well as how to distribute the money both to agent and members. I'm pausing just to make sure that the audio is working. Everyone is able to hear us. Yes. So again, I went through those slides fairly quickly. They can be available to you or will be made available to you, but I wanted to get to the key questions slide which is really the ARRC working group, is looking for feedback from the business, which would be the banks, lending institutions, about this whole question about simple interest versus compounded interest in arrears, where they think the banks are going to be going. Will they be offering compounded interest? And of course, AFS is working to be able to support that depending on how the market issues evolve. Are we still on? Good. And
just put it at the bottom.
So the working group of the ARRC is looking for feedback around using the compounded interest, verifying that that is going to be done in the industry, and then assuming that is done, the distribution method about independent calculation versus pro rata, reasons for one preference or another. So if we go to the next step slide, the first step is what we're doing here as well, which is to help socialize these issues and these questions between your business and operations group, and then based on feedback, develop a recommendation. So you'll see that feedback is being asked for by next Friday, December 13th. So that is one of the reasons we scheduled this with short notice, because we wanted to make sure we distributed this information to those joining us today that haven't been part of this yet, so that you have a chance to review and be able to provide feedback back to the ARRC Bank Loan Working Group by next Friday. So where does that leave AFS on this? So as I stated at the beginning, with SOFR, with the SOFR index rate, there are 4 overall methods for doing SOFR interest. 3 of those methods really treat SOFR very similar to LIBOR as an index rate, a fixed rate over a borrowing period with published rates. And both the AFS Level 3 and AFS Vision platforms support that today. And we are distributing this week, it was just signed off, a user guide document, which will provide each of our clients the instructions, screenshot samples, and so forth of how those first 3 SOFR methods are supported today with AFS. The 4th method, the compounding in arrears, AFS, again, is actively developing those calculations for both Level 3 and Vision, realizing that there's still some finality that needs to occur around, for example, are we going to compound with the balance plus interest? Are we going to compound using a compounded rate? And then in the syndications world, are we going to allocate by a pro rata or continue to use our independent calculation method? So we are working towards both of those options, but looking for some, again, finality from the ARRC, and now expected in January. So our developers and mathematicians here at AFS are busily following spreadsheets and scenarios since we've been participating with the working group of the ARRC since January. AFS has really taken the lead in many of these cases of coming up with scenarios and spreadsheets so that the industry can review, and then we can use as models for putting new code or capabilities into our own platforms so that we can come up with the proper calculation. The other piece of this is, of course, as I said, with new calculations for compounding and arrears, the borrower's statement, the billing statement, is going to require additional information so that the borrower can understand the compounding formula. And certainly on a syndications basis, if you're sending out notices to your lenders or borrowing groups, those notices are going to need additional data as well. As we stated before, the major loan vendors have gotten together specifically on this topic of borrowing statements and notices, and have come up with agreed upon standard data elements, additionals that would be provided on statements and notices. So we're well on our way to having the right information that needs to be displayed on the statements and notices. Another topic that was covered in a prior webcast that we did was, are there additional data fields? In addition to just what's needed to do a compounding calculation, different additional data fields that the bank would want to have in their loan system. And we listed the fact that there would be some type of indicator on each loan record so that you could designate what the fallback language would be in the credit agreement. And then secondly, what the index rate fallback would be. Is it going to fall back to SOFR? Is it going to fall back to prime, whatever it be? This is what is the fallback when LIBOR ceases to be available. We've talked before about the spread adjustments and the fact that the Fed is going to provide a spread adjustment factor so that when you have a loan that falls back from LIBOR to SOFR, since LIBOR and SOFR rates will not be exactly aligned, there will be a spread adjustment factor applied to the SOFR rate to provide better alignment. And that will really be kind of on a temporary basis as the transition occurs from LIBOR to SOFR. Once you're on SOFR and continue to roll over on SOFR, there will no longer be a need for spread adjustment. So there, obviously the systems will need a way to record what that spread adjustment is for those appropriate scenarios. We also listed before that negative rate indicator. We're looking at adding a field for that so that, or giving you an ability to track that in some place in the system. It's negative rates have become a popular topic. They're not directly related to SOFR, but they are related to interest rates. So these were the data fields that we were focused on to make sure there's a way to track this in the AFS loan platform, whether it's level 3 or Vision, but also still looking for feedback from our client group if there are additional data fields or confirmation that these data fields are things that you would need to be able to track going forward as we go through this transition period. From an informational standpoint, the LSTA, who's really been the facilitator for the ARRC working group, has instituted a weekly Q&A conference call. It's on Mondays. So I'm sure if you go to the LSTA website, you can get the information about those calls. I believe there have been 2 so far. So this is a relatively new development, but it's an open forum for any questions. And so we're providing this as an informational item if you would choose to participate in those calls. AFS has been participating. The next ARRC working group meeting, a face-to-face meeting, is still to be determined. Again, the last one was November 18th and 19th. There was a question of whether we'll be able to get together in December because of the holidays, and that's to be determined. As we stated on a previous slide, the ARRC committee is looking for feedback to their questions by next Friday, December 13th, and the plans are for them to provide final recommendations to the market by January 22nd of 2020. So those are some of the key dates coming up. AFS will be looking to set up another webcast sometime in January to continue to provide you updates, especially where with our continued development of compounding interest calculations and changes to statements and notices. So I probably just covered a lot of information in a very short time, and I'm going to ask Renee to open up the webcast for questions. And I've got a few here, so I will restate the question and attempt to provide you with a response. So one question was for the simple SOFR calculations, would there be any invoice changes required, like there could possibly be for compounding? So I think if you're saying for simple, meaning the 3 of the 4 methods that we currently support, we are not looking at any invoice or billing statement changes at this point for those methods. For compounding, we'll AFS be building functionality in the system to compound to address varying principal amounts during the period? The independent calculation method, or do you have it built already? So, yes, the answer is yes to both. We will support varying principal amounts, meaning if there's advances and pay downs. Now, this does factor into whether you do the compounding using a compounded balance or a compounded rate, because in some cases with a compounded rate, while that might seem easier to do, it doesn't always calculate correctly if there are pay downs and advances during that borrowing period. So we're following this very closely and looking at how we can support all the different scenarios that might occur on the loan. The independent calculation method, again, is how AFS does things today. So this is when you're talking about a syndication deal. AFS tracks an obligation for the borrower, which would be known as the global position, and then tracks separate obligations for the members and the agent portions, and does separate independent interest calculations on each one of those. What is your sense for the market willing to accept basis risk and use simple interest? That's a great question. That's one I don't think we can answer. We've been following this. We understand that one of the drivers for compounding in arrears is being able to hedge these loans. And because of the way the derivatives are done on a compounded basis, if you can compound your interest, you actually create a perfect hedge. Now, the question is, what's the value of that? Because we've never had that up to this point, and yet we're hedging loans all the time. So that becomes an open question. And I think that really came to the forefront during the last working group meeting in New York, where some people raised the question, with all the complexity that compounding is causing us to operationalize, is it worth the benefit of having that perfect hedge in the derivatives market? And so, again, AFS is a vendor. We'd love to have an answer today. I'm not sure. Again, I'm going to speak for myself now on an editorial basis. I'm not sure how the market's going to come to an agreement on all of this. This is a very unique situation where an event like LIBOR cessation has tremendous impact across the commercial lending market, and it's asking the market to come together and agree on new standards and ways of doing things. And that's a real challenge. That's why we've been meeting since January, and we still have a lot of open questions that we had in January, and we're still debating back and forth. So that's it. My editorial is done for that topic. Let me scroll down. Where does AFS's previous timeline stand today? Oh, thank you. I know the banks are anxious to have support for all the different SOFR methods. And so we've got 3 of them done. You have those today. This 4th method, the compounding, as we said, our original timeline was to have something delivered to each of our clients by the end of first quarter 2020. And that was based on the final definitions being completed in September of this year. Well, as you can see, we're in December. We still have some basic questions outstanding on the table. So that is going to have some impact on our timeline. While we said first quarter and we're still driving very hard to meet that date, there is more of a likelihood that we may go beyond March 31st. I think we can have a more definitive answer on that in our January update, because by then we should have the final recommendations from the ARRC committee. So again, assuming that the industry through the ARRC does agree to the final recommendations in January, we can certainly provide what the new updated timeline would be. Again, we recognize that everybody's anxious to have this. Everybody's being asked by regulators, by executives, when can we support this? AFS will support your needs, as we always have, both the level 3 and AFS Vision. We're not going to require a release upgrade. We're going to be able to, if there is code to be delivered for compounding, we will be able to deliver that on each release that each bank might be on to give you the ability to get that code in. Probably the big variable after that is going to be the amount of testing that each client will need to do to be able to declare that they are production ready. We will, of course, execute the code and test it as thoroughly as we can here at AFS, and then have a timeline for delivery to you. Another question was around look back period. So this whole look back period topic came up because now you're dealing with SOFR possibly as a daily rate that changes daily. With LIBOR, while LIBOR is an index rate, it really is treated as a fixed rate. You would have a 30-day LIBOR, so that rate is fixed for those 30 days, right? With the SOFR compounding, we're talking about SOFR, the rate changing each day on the loan. So this becomes an issue when you get to the end of your borrowing period and you want to be able to produce a billing statement ahead of time. If you don't know the rate until the next day, you can't, produce a billing statement in advance. So the proposal has been to have a look back period so that if the borrower was to borrow SOFR today, you would look back, and it's been proposed possibly 5 days, and say, well, what was the SOFR date 5 days ago? That's what the rate is today. That would allow you to know, like over holiday weekends, that would allow you to produce a billing statement 4 or 5 days in advance of when it's due to ensure that you're going to get your money at the end of the borrowing period on the due date. So AFS has the ability to support that today through the effective dating of the index rates. Many of our banks do that today with LIBOR, so that the way you update the index rate itself, you build in a 2-day adjustment or 5-day look back period into that. We are looking from a vision standpoint, AFS vision, of maybe trying to automate that even more so that the look back logic could be within the index rate schedule itself versus building it into the index rate. So, but again, the answer is level 3 would handle that through the setup of the index rates accordingly. Another question is, once ARRC provides final recommendations, when do you think AFS would provide the patch updates? So I think we covered that. What is the sense of development about term SOFR in the US? I've heard their concerns from IOSCO compliance and the FCA that may not allow a term SONIA in the UK. I don't know if we've heard that directly. The whole thing about a term SOFR, yes, it would have to be developed and then it would become another published rate. If we have that, that's, I want to say, fairly easy to support because it's like LIBOR. There's a published rate and you can go against that. So again, it's the industry has to come to terms on what they're willing to support. Anticipated delivery for additional fields and changes to billing statements. So for the additional data fields, and I'm going to answer 2 ways. From a level 3 perspective, we've looked at ways to track this information in existing fields today through tickler records and designating specific tickler types that would hold, like the fallback language indicator or the fallback index rate indicator or so forth. So that level 3 could support it today through the use of ticklers. We're not looking at adding new fields in level 3 today because they would have to be retrofitted to different releases and so forth. With Vision, we're looking at a possibility of designating some new fields specifically to do this. Vision could also track them through the tickler records as well, so we can do that today. The question is, should we designate some new fields and add those? And one of the questions would be, some of these fields we think are more on a temporary basis. You're only going to need that during the transition period from LIBOR to SOFR or to whatever other alternative rate you would be using. As far as how we're going to do the compounding, there's a question about, are we using a new earnings type for this or what other approaches are being considered? I think we're looking at leveraging fields that are in level 3 today, if at all possible. And we're thinking we may have to add one field for that. And again, we're actively trying to nail that down to know. I would think we would know in the January update. And again, it does depend on, the method that's finalized. Are we compounding a rate? Are we compounding a balance, and so forth? So there's still those questions outstanding. I'm getting near the end of my questions. I want to double check to see if you have one. Okay, we've got some.
It's not her though, it's somebody else.
Yeah, I think we're good. I'm not seeing any other questions. I'll give you a couple minutes here. Again, we will be working towards a further update next month, keep you appraised of where we are. I would encourage you to get to the slide deck that we shared from the ARRC, and if you don't have access to it, you can contact us here at AFS, and then we can certainly share that, because I encourage certainly the banks, the lending institutions to respond accordingly to the ARRC, so that your feedback can be worked into the final recommendations of where we're going. So I think we're at the end. I think I've answered all of the questions. If we missed one for some reason, please send us an email, and we'll certainly respond to that. And if it's necessary, we can respond to the entire group with any of those specific questions. Otherwise, more likely, we'll try to wait until we can do a quick update in January. Again, we'll try to get that dates scheduled shortly, so that you'll know and you can get it on your calendars. Okay.
Sorry.
Like, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a good day, and happy holidays. Thank you from AFS.